The Nazi regime is often remembered for its horrific crimes during World War II, but the aftermath of its collapse is equally unsettling. While the defeat of the Nazis is celebrated, the story of what happened to the individuals who perpetrated these heinous acts is far less discussed. The world knew that the Nazis had committed some of the greatest evils in history, but what happened to the ones responsible? Did they simply disappear, or did they evade justice? Let's dive into the complex and sometimes grim tale of how the Nazis and their enablers managed to slip through the cracks and, in many cases, vanish from sight after the war. The zones of occupation and denazification. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Allies divided the country into 4 occupation zones, one controlled by the United States, another by Britain, one by France, and the last by the Soviet Union. While the primary goal of the Allies was to eradicate Nazi influence, each zone approached this task differently. The overarching policy was called Denazification, aimed at purging German society of Nazi ideologies and dismantling the Nazi regime's power structure. But what seemed like a simple task of purging quickly grew into a massive bureaucratic challenge. In the Soviet-controlled zone, the conditions for those interned were the harshest. Forced labor camps were overcrowded, and the treatment of detainees was brutal. This led many to seek refuge in the Western zones, which were more lenient. Of these, the French zone was perhaps the least stringent. The French, disillusioned with the idea of holding every Nazi accountable, viewed Germany as a collective entity responsible for the war. This led to a more relaxed approach to denazification, with less emphasis on punishing every Nazi individual. The struggles of denazification. Between 1945 and 1950, approximately 400,000 Germans were detained in internment camps while awaiting potential trial or punishment. This might sound like a large number, but when considering that up to 45 million Germans were either members or supporters of the Nazi Party, it becomes clear that the scale of the problem was overwhelming. The process was like a never-ending line at a DMV. Slow, inefficient, and too large to manage effectively. Furthermore, the need to rebuild a shattered economy forced the Allies to reconsider their stance on denazification. With millions of Germans involved in the Nazi regime, the Allies quickly realized that removing everyone who had ever been part of the Nazi Party would leave the country without skilled professionals, crippling its ability to recover. In the British zone, for example, it was discovered that 90% of lawyers had Nazi affiliations. Rather than remove them from their jobs, Britain decided to keep a percentage of them, classifying them as nominal Nazis, those who had been members but weren't actively involved in Nazi activities. In France, the education system faced similar issues. They initially fired 3/4 of the teachers due to their Nazi sympathies, but the country found that it couldn't maintain an education system without rehiring many of them, thus rebuilding a nation while simultaneously trying to categorize who was guilty and who wasn't proved to be a monumental task. Shifting responsibility to Germany. In the aftermath of World War II, U.S. Army General Dwight D. Eisenhower initially estimated that denazification would take at least 50 years. However, by 1946, the Allies handed over the responsibility of the process to Germany itself. This shift was an unsettling move, as the German government, still under Allied control, was tasked with investigating its own citizens. Unsurprisingly, the Germans adopted a more lenient approach, especially as the Cold War loomed. One key decision made in this post-war era was to exempt those born after 1919 from punishment, labeling them as brainwashed and incapable of understanding the consequences of Nazi ideology. Meanwhile, a staggering 75% of public officials who had been removed from their positions were reinstated. In fact, by 1948, nearly 90% of those accused of Nazi affiliations were classified as minor offenders and allowed to return to society with minimal consequences. By 1951, denazification efforts officially ended, and the focus shifted to paying reparations to Holocaust victims and their families. Despite these efforts, many high-ranking Nazis managed to avoid any accountability, and the country continued to be haunted by its past. The Nazi escape to South America. While the Allies struggled with denazification, many Nazis who had been involved in the most grotesque acts of the war sought refuge in far-off lands. One of the most popular destinations for these war criminals was South America, specifically Argentina. The country's president, Juan Perón, was sympathetic to fascism, having served as a military attaché in Italy during World War II. After the war, Perón sought to strengthen Argentina's military and economy, and he saw Nazi scientists and engineers as valuable assets. Argentina opened its doors to Nazi criminals, and the country became a safe haven for thousands. Perón's government created ratlines, secret escape routes for Nazis fleeing Europe. Many of these individuals used forged documents, including fake Red Cross passports, to travel to South America. Once in Argentina, they would often change their names and try to blend into society. Some Nazis, like Adolf Eichmann, even lived under their real names, secure in the knowledge that Argentina wouldn't extradite them. However, Argentina wasn't the only country that benefited from Nazi expertise. As the Cold War began, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to capture the brains behind Nazi scientific advancements, especially in rocketry and military technology. The United States enacted Operation Paperclip in 1945, a covert operation designed to bring Nazi scientists to the U.S. to work on military projects, especially the emerging space race. These scientists, some of whom had been deeply involved in the Nazi regime, were taken to the U.S. and given new identities. Many of them went on to work for NASA and other military projects, despite their Nazi backgrounds. The Nuremberg Trials. While many Nazis managed to escape or evade justice, a significant number were still brought to trial. The Nuremberg Trials, held in 1945, were the first international trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The most prominent figures from the Nazi regime were prosecuted for their role in the war, with charges ranging from crimes against humanity to war crimes and crimes of aggression. The first Nuremberg trial saw 24 men indicted, with 12 being sentenced to death by hanging. While these trials were crucial in establishing the precedent for prosecuting war crimes, they were far from perfect. Many criticized the trials as victor's justice, claiming that the Allies were simply punishing the losers of the war while ignoring their own wartime actions. Furthermore, despite the convictions, only a fraction of the Nazis responsible for the Holocaust were brought to justice. Nazi hunters and the pursuit of justice. Although many Nazis slipped through the cracks of the Nuremberg trials, a dedicated group of individuals known as Nazi hunters spent decades tracking down those responsible for the atrocities of the war. Perhaps the most famous of these hunters was Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to bringing Nazis to justice. One of his most notable successes was the capture of Franz Stangl, a former Nazi officer who had been responsible for the deaths of thousands of disabled individuals as part of the Action T4 euthanasia program. Wiesenthal discovered Stangl living in Brazil, where he had escaped after the war. Stangl was eventually extradited to West Germany, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes. Another high-profile Nazi captured by Israeli agents was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann had fled to Argentina, where he lived under an alias and worked for a Mercedes-Benz factory. In 1960, Israeli agents tracked him down, captured him, and brought him to Israel, where he was tried for his crimes and eventually executed. Even as late as 2019, efforts to bring Nazis to justice continued. Jacques Palage, a former Nazi guard who had entered the United States after the war, was deported at the age of 95 after it was revealed that he had served at a forced labor camp during the war. The long pursuit of justice for war criminals shows that, while many Nazis escaped, the hunt for accountability continued for decades. If you found this deep dive into the post-Yahuswanin fate of the Nazis both fascinating and unsettling, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more history stories that shed light on the untold chapters of our past. Let us know in the comments what historical events or figures you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.